I'd been very isolated that year in England, but I survived, thanks to the wives of the other physicists and the other things. However, what can be, in our culture, the isolating experience of early motherhood seemed even worse on my return to Toronto. I then had what can only be described as culture shock, or maybe depression in reverse. Culture shock in reverse, or depression. A fairly serene, eventless life in the country suddenly became more complicated. A friend of my sister's thought I needed something to do, so she said, why don't you become a member of the Junior Women's Committee of the Art Gallery? I thought, well, I might try that. And I was just totally alienated. I thought, it just was not for me. There were soon also growing concerns about the schooling of our kids. I enrolled our eldest in the Institute of Child Study, but withdrew him because I felt he just wasn't ready. Later, when I felt he needed to be with children his own age, I found that we were too well off to qualify for the very good daycare, public daycare in our neighborhood. It's probably still there in Jesse Ketchum School, in fact, it's daycare center. Inspired with the idea of bilingualism, we finally sent both kids to the Toronto French School, which had a pre-kindergarten, only to find that our eldest son still wasn't ready for the experience. And his difficulties would continue throughout his schooling. And it was only when he was in his 40s and his two children were having extreme difficulties in their schooling that we learned that all three of them were in the autistic spectrum. So it wasn't surprising that he had so much trouble, but in that period, the 60s, when he was at school, he was the one born in 61, there was absolutely no knowledge of what we would now call Asperger's. And so we went to the Hanks Institute and the advice of the school. They had no clue what the problem was. And I think it was about the 1980s when they finally became aware of Asperger's syndrome and how it was related to autism in Canada, in North America. So there were all these issues about schooling going on in the background, and I became really, really interested. First of all, I had been interested in education to begin with, which has got me into teaching. I had been fascinated with my schooling in Toronto, then at the American College, and I also had spent a year in Europe, and each experience was so different. Each time I got a totally different experience, and thought all this is called education, but it's not all the same. And then I became fascinated with the teaching, and finally, when my wonderful older child had problems in every school he attended, I was really deeply concerned. What was it about schools that made them so alienating for some children? So the 60s provided not only the ongoing experience of teaching, but the experience of childbirth, motherhood, being the mother of school children, all common women's experiences, of course, that feminist scholars would soon come to realize badly needed to be explored, analyzed, and deconstructed from a feminist point of view. Moving into politics, there was lots going on in my life in the 1960s that drew me into politics. I should preface this by noting that we undergraduates and graduates of the 50s were sometimes labeled the quiet generation, and I mentioned that, and I mentioned already the apathy there really was. We were too apathetic to have a meeting, so we just named the apathy. I think we were actually reacting against what we saw as the overly raw culture of sports, dating, and collegiate life in the 1950s, enthusiasms for which we just didn't really fully share. I don't know, I'm not sure quite why, but we just did. I think we were also undermined at Smith in the 50s by the attitudes of some of our supposed mentors. Older women faculty at Smith sometimes seemed bitter and angry. I now know they had very good reason to be bitter and angry, as the college openly promoted the hiring of more male faculty in order to raise standards. And what about the men? I only encountered one male professor at Smith who genuinely engaged me. There were faculty heroes, though. Gwendolyn Carter, a Canadian who taught government, was much loved, and there were others who were also loved and admired, but I didn't have the good fortune to have them as my instructors. Another potential hero might have been W.H. Auden, the poet, who was writer-in-residence at Smith during my second year there. But admiration for him soon passed on when he told us that, since we were women, our education was essentially useless, except that we might do some good in the world if we introduced our male children good books. No one even walked out of his lecture, including me. It was compulsory. It was actually in so-called chapel, which was compulsory, and maybe we were some generation. But when our graduation speaker, Adlai Stevenson, actually repeated almost word for word what Auden had said, at least some of us eventually realized that we were very angry. We may not have known exactly what we wanted to do politically, but in some underground way, I was furious with the idea that women's education was principally of use for the education of my male children. I can't remember exactly when I decided to vote for the NDP, but it was just before or just after our marriage in 1960. And Jim and I used to fight about to see who could get the poster in the window first. And once the Liberal was coming up the street with a bunch of posters, and I ran all the way up to Avenue Road in Davenport, around the corner to the NDP office, grabbed the posters, got back before the Liberal guy got there, and stuck my poster in the downstairs window, so Jim had to put his in. I think actually the Liberal guy never stopped when he saw the NDP poster. Jim didn't get one. But he eventually became involved in the NDP too. We were very active in our local riding association. And this is where I started meeting people on Hazelton Avenue who were really to influence me in a way that I'd never really stopped to think about before. Ellen Adams, who worked for the party in the provincial legislature, became a really good friend. She was a specialist in helping people wend their way through the maze of workmen's compensation bureaucracy in Ontario. And I was just fascinated by her way of life, the tales she told me connected with her life and her employment. We both worked on her campaign when she ran for provincial office. Another older neighbor, I can't remember her first name, but she was known as Mrs. Fogelberg. She had worked in Winnipeg soup kitchens in the 1930s. And during the first years on Hazelton, she had this one woman campaign to save the trees, and was always ripping posters off that people put on. I was fascinated by all these people, and eventually, because of Mrs. Fogelberg, perhaps, we became members, active members of the local residents association that dealt with all the local issues of our Yorkville neighborhood. There were issues about traffic patterns proposed, and about a proposed high-rise at the corner of Yorkville and Hazelton, which I'm proud to say we defeated for many. It was going to be a 10 or 12-story building. There's quite a, I guess, a 3-story building there now, which is much more in keeping, but we defeated the high-rise. As a result of my involvement, I was on the CBC once on the television show talking about trying to keep the neighborhood a good one for families. One year, I blanketed the neighborhood with leaflets protesting the making of Hazelton into a one-way street. That battle I lost. And on many occasions, I canvassed door-to-door in elections and scrutineered on election day. Eventually, my politicking began to focus on educational issues as well as neighborhood issues. And I was part of a team that planned educational policy for the NDP the year that the party tried to have a presence in the municipal election. I tried unsuccessfully to found an after-school program at Jesse Ketchum, and for a year or two, they wouldn't let me do it. And so for a year, or maybe two, I ran one myself in our house. Then, for a brief period, I joined the Association of Women Electors, and here comes Kay McPherson again. At that time, she wasn't living in our neighborhood, but she was the president of the Association of Women Electors that year. And she said, well, why not, since you're so interested in education, why don't you go and serve the board of education and write reports for the AWE. So I went, and I don't think I did it very many times, but imagine my delight when the board decided to introduce sex education into the schools. And there was a violent debate at the board. There was a man there who felt really threatened by this idea. He said it would be impossible for unmarried women teachers to teach the subject. Unmarried women should not know anything about sex. So how could they possibly teach it? Funny, he didn't mention anything about unmarried men. I just couldn't believe it. I chuckled as I remembered what would he have thought if he'd known my Harvard single woman colleague and her careful instruction of all the girls in all the known methods of contraception. I've tried to remember when I became involved in the Voice of Women. I know I did, but I can't really pin it down. I certainly attended anti-war teach-ins and participated in protests about the promotion of war industry jobs at U of T. But whenever it actually happened, my involvement with Voice of Women was brief. I simply didn't have the time for it, which was a pity, and I'm thinking back. This was because